Welcome everyone, those from Chicago and those who traveled very far, those in person and those attending via Zoom to the first day of Yiddish Ecologies. I will begin with an acknowledgement of land and labor, noting that a land acknowledgement is not the same as land itself. Several Native nations share a connection to this region of Chicago and to each other. These include Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi, all related Anishinaabe tribes, in addition to Ho-Chunk, Kaskaskia, Kickapoo, Mascoutin, Menominee, Meskwaki, Miamia, Peoria, Sac, and Fox. These nations lived and traveled here long before non-native settlers incorporated Chicago. Today, Chicago boasts one of the largest indigenous populations on the continent. We thank and acknowledge these peoples, as well as express our gratitude for the labor which built and which maintains this space. I want to thank my colleagues, Dr. Jessica Kirzane and Hannah Tatseo. To read all of the proposals, we had more than 40 applications to speak. We read the proposals and organized the conference all together. At the Greenberg Center, Nancy Pardee and Mike Phillips coordinated logistics, food, tech, and more to make this event possible. I also want to thank Professor Karen Underhill of UIC and Sam Johnson for their work to support this conference. And I want to thank all the applicants as well. And I hope that after the next few days, we will remain in touch and continue exploring what Yiddish ecologies might mean. Closing notes tomorrow afternoon will be delivered by Dr. Kirzane, and she will speak about some future opportunities for collaboration. I also want to announce to save the date for part 2. These 2 days are only part 1. There will be part 2 on April 7th, which will be fully online with several speakers based in Europe. And part 2 will be based completely on the poet Avram Sutzkever and ecology. We got so many proposals to focusing on Sutzkever that we decided to do a second workshop just on him. All right, so most often the key word associated with Yiddish studies is diaspora. This conference is about exploring what happens when that keyword shifts from diaspora to ecology. How might recentering Yiddish studies, even just for a couple of days, put us in conversation with other fields and attend to that word itself, field, as a space of botanical possibility? What emerges when we think less in the realm of diaspora, a term that has offered so much theoretical richness, so much communion with other disciplines, and think more in the material, biological, animal, botanical realms of ecology? Can we speak of ecological language, not just of loan words, but of shared linguistic landscapes? Is ecological language more than a metaphor? How might we think of ecological time in relation to poetry, the reinvention of language again and again by those who speak it and those who learn it? How does the credo of Do'ikayt, of Hereness, relate, for example, to ecological thought which emerged in other languages? Let's consider how we define ecology, and I'm curious to see what definitions might emerge over the next 2 days, and how each presenter might use the term ecology differently. For my work, I often think of ecology as kinship or entanglement. Deborah Bird-Rose, an anthropologist known for her work with Indigenous people in Australia, writes in the book Wild Dog Dreaming, quote, "This entangled quality of life on Earth depends on and supports connectivity. There are numerous ways of thinking about these matters. I offer one way, the kinship mode. It situates us here on Earth, asserts we're not alone in time or place. We're members of entangled generations of Earth life, generations that succeed each other in time and place. Ethical questions within the world of connectivity start with how to appreciate the differences between humankind and others, while at the same time also thinking that we are interdependent, how to engage in world making across species." Now place this framework of entanglement in conversation with the great poet Avram Sutzkever, as he portrays his childhood on the steppe. In the poetry collection Siberia, his poems enmesh the domestic world with animal life, what Rose might describe the paradigm of connectivity. In the poem In the Hut, the poetic speaker's young self is constituted through birdsong. And I quote a translation by Harshav and Harshav. Setting sun on roads in icy blue, sweet the slumber colors in your heart, from the valley shimmering toward you. In the snow of sunset shines a hut. Wonder woods sway wide on window panes, magic sleighs ring in a ring. A niche in the attic, doves, their humming rains, humming out my face. And the Eyshe flashing crystals on its icy deck trembles, half unreal, half beguiled. Silent soaring copulas protect a blooming world, a 7-year-old child. The first verse names the Eyshe the Siberian river, rooting the poem in geographic specificity. Sutzkever pairs that grand landscape with a domestic interior of an attic and its cooing doves. Auf ein Pitzel boydem vorken toiben, vorken ois mein ponem untereis. The verse structure sets up a parallel between those living below the doves in the attic and life below the ice in the river. Harshav and Harshav translate Sutzkever's verbal coinage as cooing out my face. This strange neologism pulls at the sound of animal speech, extending it via the verbal complement ois into the human body. The accompanying illustration by Marc Chagall reflects the mirrored entanglement between poetic speaker and external animal world. And in this illustration by Chagall, the poet is holding a pen that pierces the mirror. And with that pen, he writes the word Sibir. Sibir is filled with the sounds of animals made rapturously surreal, doves that coo a human face, wolves that sniff the music's flesh. When the book Sibir was published, some readers were startled by its image of Siberia as a lush place of enchantment rather than empty space or industrial space. This leads me to consider one's own ecological entanglements. Growing up in the Bronx, my father would point to the striated grooves in the rock as we drove down the Cross Bronx Expressway, telling me how dynamite cut through the rock to build the highway, which displaced up to 60,000 people, the result of Robert Moses's segregationist urban planning. And in Central Park, my father would show me how the rocks beneath the picnic blanket were boulders dragged there by Ice Age glaciers. And once, walking the abandoned train tracks of Van Cortlandt Park, a moose appeared. Perhaps it had wandered down from Maine. Could that be? Did we really see it? A great beast slinking by. Maybe this image of the enchanted Bronx surprises you, like Sutzkever's Siberia surprised its readers. But even in the Bronx, we live in multi-species kinship. Even the stones blasted to make a highway do speak. So I am so excited to begin this adventure of exploring together what Yiddish ecologies might reveal, what the frame of ecology in conversation with diaspora might say. And so with that, let's get started with the first panel on Do'ikayt and postcolonialism. Okay, so our first panel is titled on Do'ikayt and postcolonialism. Our speakers are Madeleine Cohen, whose paper is titled Do'ikayt, Hereness Between the Human, the Natural, and the Built-in Works of Moyshe Kulbak. And I want to refer everyone that full biographies are in the packet so that you can read a bit more about the panelists that way. The second panelist will be speaking via Zoom. Auden Finch's paper is titled Beyond the Speculative Borderlands, the Geo-Colonial Imaginaries of Lazar Borodulin's Zayt. And Eyshe Beirich will be speaking on Dead Stones or Desolated Palestine in the Polish-Yiddish imagination of Mendel Mann. So we will start with Mendel.
Shalom Aleichem Alamin, a großen Dank Anna and Jessica and Chana. Wonderful to be here, everybody. I'm really pleased to get to start these discussions with you all today and tomorrow. Just check that okay. Like many great writers of the early 20th century, Moyshe Kulbak's biography could be defined by the various urban centers through which he moved, starting with his hometown of Smorgon, the years of the First World War, which he spent in Kovno or Kaunas, a year in Minsk, then one in Vilna, followed by 3 in Berlin, before reversing his trajectory back to Vilna and finally to Minsk, which at that point was the capital of the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic. However, in Kulbak's case, it's very clear that this peripatetic existence did not result in a lack of interest in or identification with the places he lived. It's readily apparent as we review Kulbak's body of work that places and locations play an important role. I think more so than in perhaps any other Yiddish writer of his quality, which I, by my Meinung, is sehr hoch. So this is something I would love to discuss and debate if you have another writer that you propose to take this spot. So starting with his early revolutionary poem in 1920, Stott, we move to many works in which the setting takes center stage. Rysen, meaning the area of Belarus or White Russia, Vilna, the Disney Child Herald, which is set in Berlin, Zelmenjaner, set in Minsk, as well as many other works in which the locations are not necessarily named, but the setting somewhere in Rysen in Belarus is clear, as in the poem Asora di Braya, which perhaps Anna will be speaking about, as well as Mashiach ben Ephraim, which is set somewhere near Vilna, as is Smorgon, so it's likely in that region. Attention's been paid to the locatedness of Kulbak's writing, as in Jason Wagner's recent dissertation on Rysen, and Sasha Senderovich and my own work on Zelmenjaner, as well as attention has been paid to the influence of his time in Berlin by writing by Mark Kaplan and Rachel Zelig. So I've long been drawn to the locatedness of Kulbak's writing, and the poem Vilna, about which I'll speak a bit today, was one of the first Yiddish literary works I read that helped to spark what became my dissertation project on the idea of a Poetics of Do'ikayt, about which I'll say more shortly and probably we get to discuss over the course of the 2 days. So my dissertation focused on Kulbak's novel Zelmenjaner and its construction of a richly heteroglossic microcosm of Jewish life in one family courtyard in revolutionary Minsk. My paper today is the second iteration following a talk I gave at AJS of a project in which I'm trying to investigate a different aspect of Kulbak's Poetics of Do'ikayt that are in conversation with current interests that we see here today in eco-criticism in Yiddish literature and ideas of the non-human. So I'm beginning to identify a trend across several of Kulbak's works in which figurative language, especially his use of metaphor and simile, are used to blur the categories of the human, the Jewish, the natural, and built landscapes. And already I'm thinking that the term entanglement is probably a useful one in addition to this kind of category blur that I've been thinking about. So in this, I think that Kulbak is not only a Yiddish poet of place or of lived Jewish space, which is the term that I and others have used, but he's also something like the poet of Jews in place. His Jewish characters are so connected to the places they live that they often merge into the natural and the built landscapes through his figurative imagery. These landscapes and places in turn often take on human and Jewish characteristics, and the borders between natural and built landscape are notably porous, as the man-made is often overtaken by natural growth, especially in the form of moss, lichen, and processes of rot, decay, and new vegetal growth. So today I'm going to just present some brief examples of this imagery in 3 works: Mashiach ben Ephraim from 1924, Vilna, the poem from 1926, and Zelmenjaner from 29 to 30, and the second part from 1933 to 35. And so my goal is just to start to demonstrate this trend that I'm identifying across Kulbak's writing in different genres and over more than a decade of his writing career. So I'll say a word before I begin about what Do'ikayt, what literary or poetic Do'ikayt has meant for me, and hopefully that will be developed in this slightly new way in this talk. So Do'ikayt, meaning Hereness, is a term that's been associated with the Bund, the largest Jewish socialist party in pre-revolutionary Russia and interwar Poland. I've written about this in my dissertation and in other articles, so I'll be brief today, but I'm very happy if we discuss this more. When speaking of the Bund, as well as other Jewish socialist, non-territorialist, and Yiddishist movements, Do'ikayt describes the commitment to organizing for improved conditions for Jews, both individually in terms of economics and social conditions, as well as collectively as a national or ethnic group in the places where they live, wherever they live. So this is a quotation from Levi Kodis that I found in an essay of his from 1947. The Bund has always fought for continuity, for creative national life, for Do'ikayt, for the right to remain rooted in the ground where the Jewish masses live and fight. Do'ikayt became associated also with the Bund's focus on supporting Yiddish language and culture during the interwar period in Poland. So in my work, I've been borrowing this term from the political realm to identify a trend in Yiddish literature, modernist literary representations of lived Jewish space. These are works of literature that engage deeply with the specific landscapes of Jewish life, representing experiences of rootedness and groundedness in the cities, städtlich, villages, and countryside of Yiddishland, while at the same time, the works also explore the challenges faced by Jews that motivated the organizing for improved conditions by groups like the Bund and many others across the Jewish political spectrum. So in my earlier work, I've focused on more explicitly politically engaged examples of literature as Do'ikayt, but what I'm trying to do now is focus on an aspect that may have more in common with a movement like Landkenntnis, knowing the land, about which Sam Casso has written, perhaps than the Bund, more explicitly political organization. So Mashiach ben Ephraim, the first work I'll speak about, is a fascinating work of mystical modernism that fittingly, in its one English translation, follows one of the tales of Rebbe Nachman of Wrocław, and I think that's kind of the trend in which we can read it. That's in Joachim Neugerschell's translation in his Jene Welt anthology. Avram Noverstern describes Mashiach ben Ephraim, which I just guessed people might be a bit less familiar with than other of Kulbak's writings. He says it's the first prose work that Kulbak published in Berlin, though Kulbak had already left at that point for Vilna. And he writes, and this I'll note is translated by Mark Kaplan, which is fitting because Kaplan has also written about Mashiach ben Ephraim. In Mashiach ben Ephraim, Kulbak strove to formulate in an original manner the central spiritual problems of his generation: revolution, apocalypse, messianism. With a seemingly loose narrative structure, Mashiach ben Ephraim ties together the most extreme opposites: redemption and death, eroticism and violence, and the complicated relationship between the masses and their leaders. The protagonist of this work is a simple Jew who lives a vegetative existence in the heart of the Slavic landscape. I'll stop there for time. So I'm especially grateful, of course, for this wonderful description of the main character Benya as vegetative. And I would add that his closest associates, Simcha Plachte and Gimpel, the philosopher, are both strongly associated with nature as well, though they each have kind of their own philosophy of nature. And nature itself looms quite large in the work through the narrative's attention to descriptions of landscape, often with luscious descriptions of the landscape and weather as the seasons turn. So I'll give just one example of the blurring between the human and the natural in this work. Early on, Benya is experiencing an existential crisis, which leads him to leave his mill and to go into nature. So the miller spent the whole next day lying on the loamy hill that stood behind his home. He gradually understood the clay of his body. His face was buried in the sand, and his crooked fingers were clutching the roots. He lay there with the hill, and it was as though he had been poured into it. And if a blade of grass were to spring up anywhere, it would grow out through him, out of his back. And it was as if the clay were breathing and shaping up in hands, feet, head, chest, and there were no difference in the world between Benya and the clay of the earth. Nor did he know whether he was a human being or a stone lying on the road overgrown with lichen. So throughout the work, Benya is closely associated with clay, with lame. And I think it's clear in this example, this is the reference to the idea of lame as the stuff from which Adam, the first man, was crafted, reminding us that organically or originally, there's no difference between human and the material of both the organic and the inorganic natural world. Benya imagines himself becoming part of the earth as though he'd been poured into the hill to the degree that grass could grow out of him. Images of moss and lichen growing from people and built spaces occur in all three works that I'm going to discuss today. So here, Benya also feels like a stone overgrown with lichen. And on the next page, he returns to his mill, which had previously already been described as overgrown with mosses and weeds. The roof crept down like a fur over the mill until it touched the ground. And now, upon Benya's return to the mill after this kind of existential awakening, the mill is described, it had become shaggier and older, and a sapling was growing from one wall. And we'll see repetitions of this images of natural growth coming out of built structures and moss and lichen in both Vilna and Zelmenjaner, to which I will now turn. So the novel Zelmenjaner, written after Kulbak's return to Minsk in the late 20s, is a very different prose work from Mashiach ben Ephraim. Zelmenjaner owes more to Sholem Aleichem's humorous serialized novels than to the tales of Rebbe Nachman, which I think is the closest kind of parallel or model for Mashiach ben Ephraim. Yet despite the turn to the contemporary post-revolutionary moment and the humorous challenges that the new Soviet order poses to the large multi-generational family living in Minsk, both the characters and the poetic descriptive narration of Zelmenjaner bear similarities with Mashiach ben Ephraim. So the Zelmenjaners are defined by their love of nature and their earthiness. The first chapter tells us that all Zelmenjaners have a faint odor of musty hay mixed with something else. And I'll just note, I am showing only the English, but I have all of the kind of Yiddish key terms here. So if you're curious about what the exact kind of Yiddish phrases were, I can refer to them. So several times throughout the novel, we're reminded of the Zelmenjaner odor. The smell has something to do with the family's origins in deep Russia, as in this next description of the family coming together after the death of one of the uncles. The Zelmenjaners exuded calm and tranquility, the raw smell of deep Russian earth. The love of nature of several characters is emphasized, and this is done similarly as we just saw in Mashiach ben Ephraim, through the narration's frequent poetic descriptions of the weather, especially the cold of winter. So the next quotation, the winter, like a silver fish, flip-flopped in Chayela's heart. She had the Zelmenjaner's love of nature. And I have to give a very brief aside because in my most recent rereading of this quotation, I finally noticed that it echoes this fabulous story that Benjamin Harshav tells in his Wexler Oral History interview about being one of Kulbak's students. So Harshav says, this is translated from Yiddish, once on a cold day, ice cold, snowing, he, Kulbak, opened the windows. He gave a few coins to someone in class and told him, go and bring back a herring. So he came back with the herring and Kulbak said, okay, now write. Snow and herring, you understand. From there, the imagination should take over and you have to picture Harshav's kind of playful little smile as he's telling this story. So while I have always loved this anecdote, I confess that I had not understood what snow and herring was supposed to inspire, but we can see it evidently in this precise image that Kulbak writes. So that was just a wonderful moment I found. The second part of Zelmenjaner, written between 1933 and 1935, focuses on the decay of the Zelmenjaner's courtyard, their Heif, and the approaching end of the family's way of life as they fail to kind of keep up with what's required of Soviet society. So in this section, an image is repeated 3 times, comparing the yard to a stagnant pond. And the young man Salka who's described as the last noble youth of the yard and an educated young native of the yard, is compared to a golden carp swimming in this stagnant pond. So here, what might the yard have been compared to? The yard might have been compared to a stagnant old pond. A green scum covered it, and beneath the drooping branches, a green scum covered it beneath the drooping branches of the trees. The air was dank and malarial. Even the golden carp that sometimes wriggled in the slime left only a fleeting wrinkle in its thick green crust. These images of decay are similar to those in Mashiach ben Ephraim of the moss and lichen overgrowing the courtyard and of rot that leads to new natural growth. In a passage close to the end of the novel, we read, "Although the yard had no trees, this didn't mean that nothing grew in it. Uncle Yuda's roof bloomed with a delicate green velvety mold. There was also a pole in the yard with an old chamber pot at the top of it, braving the elements. With better care, it might have made something of itself, perhaps even a tree." And so I'll note that Auden Finch, who we're about to hear from, has written specifically about the images of microbial life in Zellman-Janner. So in part, my attention was drawn to these features thanks to Auden's work. So I'll just note for now the similarity to Benya's mill that we saw in the example from Mashiach ben Ephraim. So here the image has a distinctly urban cast to it. A tree is a pole with a pot on top. And I'll move to a final example of Kulbak's poem, Vilna. So the poem Vilna's thick engagement with the city of Vilna as lived Jewish space is built of metaphors and similes that combine the built landscape of the city, the human inhabitants of the city, and representations of Yiddishkeit in both the roles of tenor and vehicle interchangeably. So I've tried to give you a sense of what I mean by that here. That is, each of these 3 categories of image is figured by the 2 other categories in turn. This interchange of tenor and vehicle unsettles our understanding of what in the poem is being represented and what is the figure. So is the city like a human, or is the human like a city? Part 1 of the poem introduces both of these kinds of images for the city. So the city figured as human and figured as Yiddishkeit, or as examples of Jewishness. And I won't get into all of it, but I've color coded it so you can see these kind of different categories of images here. So I'll just focus on this line. He listens. The old veins of gray alleys and synagogues are awake, resounding like a hoarse, dusty heart. So here the city is being figured as human, or at least as a living being, in the metaphor of the alleys as veins connecting the synagogues, and as a heart that is beating, klingen, also described as awake. Most of the rest of this opening part of the poem develops the image of the city as Jewish text, object, or practice. So I've referred to this as representations of Yiddishkeit as a way to account for all of them. They include the Tehillim, the Psalter, or Book of Psalms, a prayer, which is a tefillah, a nigun, a melody, Kabbalah, Kabbalah, the amulet, which is a kameya, and a holy book, Sefer, and parchment. So it's largely a group of textual images, but not exclusively. The overall effect is one in which the streets, the stones, and the buildings of Vilna, its built landscape, exude Jewishness, Jewish texts, sounds, and practices. And equally important to note are the several places in which nature enters into these images. So we have here the moon, the quiet summer mists, and especially this image. You are a dark amulet set in Lithuania, written all over, gray and old, with moss and with lichen. The image of Vilna as an amulet set in Lithuania places the built and Jewish city in the landscape of the country of Lithuania. And the writing that constitutes the amulet, the kameya, is again described like moss and lichen, which we are now coming to see are these favored forms of growth in Kulbak's work. So this is an image of the built Jewish landscape of the city in a process of being overtaken by natural growth, an image of a kind of natural decay of the man-made that generates new life, and in which the natural, the Jewish, and the man-made become connected. The image brings together Jewish built and natural in one extended metaphor, which I'm seeing as an important blurring of categories, both for this poem and for Kulbak's poetics more broadly. So I'll show just one final example of this kind of blurring in the category of images that represent humans as like the built city. So these images are focused in part 3 of the poem, and I'll just focus on this one section. Which begins, can't see it, narrow. Here. Narrow like your streets are your gloomy Jews, mute foreheads like the broad frozen walls of the synagogue courtyard, and mossy brows like the roofs over your ruins. The thinness of the Jewish men is likened to the narrowness of city streets, and their foreheads compared to the walls of the Schulhof, their eyebrows to the moss and lichen growing on ruined roofs. This set of images comparing humans to the city is the mirror of the earlier images that compared the city to the human, creating this confusion of tenor and vehicle, of symbol and symbolized, that blurs the category of human and built city. And to complicate this one step further, nature has again entered into these similes. So the walls and the roofs of the Schulhof show the same process of man-made decay giving rise to new organic life. The moss becomes a part of the roofs that are a metaphor for the Jews' eyebrows. And since these are specifically the walls and roofs of the Schulhof, it's an image both of the built city, but of course also of Yiddishkeit. So this final image combines all of these 4 elements that I've been looking at: human-built, Yiddishkeit, and nature. And I'm seeing this as a kind of profound example of the poetic Do'ikayt that I've been interested in. So there are a number of other examples of these images in this poem that continue to develop this effect, and several other key components of the poem that engage with nature, especially an extended metaphor of the Velia River as a naiad spirit, which is a theme that comes up in other of his poems. However, I'll save those explorations for another time and conclude by saying that I'm hoping to continue developing these readings of Kulbak's Poetics of Do'ikayt that engage with landscapes that are urban, rural, natural, Jewish, and something I haven't had time to talk about today, also attentive to the non-Jewish inhabitants of these places. Through a focus of his blurring on the categories of human, Jewish, natural, and built, we can understand Kulbak not only as a poet of place or nature, but a poet of Jews and Jewish life in place, often so grounded that they might merge with the hillside while their homes do the same. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was such an excellent opening presentation, Mendel. I have so many thoughts, and I'm excited to talk more about Moyshe Kulbak later on. I really appreciate all of the work that went into organizing and moderating this panel today, and I'm so sad that I'm not able to be present in Chicago with all of you, but I'm all the more happy that I have the chance to present virtually. I'll be talking today about a novel called Auf jener Zayt Sambation, which was published in New York in 1929, and which concerns a number of ecologically interesting topics ranging from terraforming to animal agriculture to genetic engineering. So to begin with, I want to give a brief overview of the novel itself before getting deeper into the details. Auf jener Zayt Sambation is a novel written by Lazar Borodulin, this man over here on the right, and it's essentially the story of a New York journalist named Sam Hoffman, who travels across the Sambation River into the land of the Red Jews, the so-called Rote Yiddelech. And we'll talk more about the Sambation River throughout this presentation, but in short, this is a river from Jewish mythology, which flows violently with stones and geysers, and sometimes smoke and fire 6 days a week, only resting on Shabbos. And on the other side of that river, Auf jener Zayt Sambation, is the land of the Borodulin, who are meant to be the descendants of the 10 lost tribes. And what initially entices Hoffmann to travel across the Sambation is the story of a man named Dr. Berger, who has become quite famous in New York as the inventor of a powerful death ray, Tötesstrahlungen. This Dr. Berger has recently disappeared, and he is rumored to have been taken across the Sambation by a young woman named Miriam, who was herself a Tochter von der Yiddish, a daughter of the Red Jews. So Hoffmann, hoping to investigate this story further, gets the idea to travel far away from home, traverse a dangerous mountain range, and then cross the Sambation on Shabbos, which is, of course, the one day a week that the river rests and ceases to throw stones and other dangerous projectiles at anyone who tries to cross it. And once he's safely in the land of the Red Jews, Hoffmann is greeted warmly by its inhabitants and given an in-depth tour of their country, which is highly technologically advanced. He's given rides on airships. He's taught about the Red Jews' political system, their transportation infrastructure, their medical practices, and their various environmental engineering schemes. And Borodulin's aim with this novel was really to educate the Yiddish-speaking public on technological developments that he thought were going to revolutionize the future. Most of the novel consists of Hoffmann being lectured to by various characters about the mechanics of an answering machine or about a magnetic levitation train. He also learns about the population engineering projects that the Red Jews have undertaken, which have rendered them resistant to diseases of both the body and the mind. Borodulin's background was as a science writer rather than as a novelist, which is something that I'll get to in a minute. And Auf jener Zayt Sambation can at times be a bit clunky and overly technical. Like a lot of Yiddish fiction, it's been mostly forgotten, it's never been translated into English, and it's been virtually untouched by secondary scholarship. But in spite of this, I do think this novel deserves some attention. On the one hand, it reflects how the myth of the Sambation and the Red Jews have been used throughout European and Ashkenazi history as a canvas for constructing racial geographies and political futures. And at the same time, and I'll argue towards the end that these 2 points are intimately connected, it offers insight into the way that Borodulin imagined how humans could and should use science and technology to shape those particular futures. So before we get into the novel or the history that it emerges out of, let's get to know its author a little bit better. Lazar Borodulin was born in Crimea in 1879, and he also lived in Lodz and central Ukraine before he moved to New York in 1907, which is where he would live until he died in the late 1940s. And New York is where he begins to publish regularly on popular science topics in the Yiddish press, initially in Der Volksadvokat and Die Wahrheit, but later on primarily in Der Tag. Borodulin really saw it as his mission to transmit the world of the natural sciences to the Yiddish-speaking public. He even gave guided tours of the Natural History Museum in New York, going off of this advertisement in the Vorwärts from the 1920s. In 1919, Borodulin wrote a short piece in David Ignatov's journal Schriften, where he speaks very critically of the state of Yiddish natural science literature. He lists off 10 or 12 books which have been published in the last decade, of which he says he's only read 3, and that he wasn't very impressed by these 3 at all. He rips into a volume on astrology that was published by the Workman Circle, saying that it's full of Deutschmarisch words like Durchmaß and Umfang, which he claims are totally incomprehensible to the average Yiddish reader. And he even goes so far as to say that it is, quote, worse than Targum, because Targum is totally unreadable for someone who speaks Yiddish but not Aramaic, whereas any Yiddish speaker could read this astronomy book but wouldn't be able to understand a thing. His argument is that the type of person who's reading natural science texts in Yiddish is the type of person who has no background education in the natural sciences, and that because of that, they require, quote, the most simple, clear, and comprehensible language. And while there's definitely something a bit condescending about that attitude, it's also apparent that Borodulin is someone who is genuinely passionate about increasing public awareness of science and scientific discoveries, which is why he's so concerned with readability and accessibility. So it's interesting that when he decides to publish his own book-length work on science and technology in Yiddish, he does so through the medium of fiction, and he sets his story in a fictional world that is specific to Ashkenazi Jewish mythology. So let's talk about where the Sambation River comes from and why Borodulin might have chosen to feature it in his novel. The concept of a river whose flow is regulated by the Sabbath has a long history in Jewish folklore and mythology, but its first mention actually comes to us from a Roman source. There's a really interesting argument put forward by Daniel Stein Koken that the Sambation actually comes to us from the Roman historian Pliny the Elder, who claims that there is a river in Judea which, quote, runs dry every Sabbath. And this is interpreted by Cohen as a mockery of the Jewish Sabbath, which was seen as emblematic of sloth and deprivation among Romans. So from the beginning, this river is imagined as denoting ethnic difference. By placing it in Judea and associating with Jewish practices, Pliny is saying that the people who live near this river are culturally distinct in a way that essentially makes them different. And the second mention that we have of a sabbatical river comes from the Jewish historian Josephus, who writes of a river in modern-day Lebanon, which flows with speed and intensity on every seventh day, but that during the week it, quote, presents the spectacle of a dry bed. And Josephus says that this river is called the Sabbatikon, which is where we can assume to have inherited the word Sambation from. Cohen reads this as an inversion of Pliny's river, which associates the Sabbath with drought and inaction, whereas instead Josephus sees the same image as a flowing river to depict the miraculous abundance of the Sabbath. And over the next couple millennia, this story about a river that obeys the laws of the Sabbath evolves and transforms. It's moved away from Palestine and into some obscure Afro-Eurasian periphery, often in the Horn of Africa, occasionally in Yemen or Saudi Arabia. And its primary function becomes not to prove the power of the Sabbath on earth, but to guard the land inhabited by the lost tribes of Israel. In Christian sources, the Sambation is also associated with a variety of other myths, including Alexander the Great, the story of Gog and Magog, and the kingdom of Prester John. The Sambation enters the Yiddish-speaking world as a river, usually either encircling or encircled by a huge mountain range that flows so violently and rapidly during the week that it would be impossible to cross and would only calm on the Shabbos. So physically, it's too dangerous to cross, and the only day that it would be safe to try is a day where Jews are forbidden by religious law from undertaking journeys. And precisely because this border is supposedly impenetrable, it naturally provokes curiosity about what might be on the other side. And Borodulin is interested in the river, as a natural formation. And when he describes it in the novel, he compares it with other features of the North American natural landscape, whether that's the Palisades along the banks of the Hudson River or the geysers of Yellowstone National Park. He uses it, as with most of the details in the novel, as a plot device for talking about the natural sciences. But I would argue that he's also enticed by the way that the myth of the Sambation is historically entangled in fantasies about isolated populations and the possibilities that they represent to Euro-American outsiders. And the Sambation during the medieval and early modern period becomes a point of fascination throughout Christian and Jewish Europe, as the barrier between a present reality and an anticipated messianic future. Andrew Tobolowsky writes that, quote, descriptions of the lost tribes would serve as a mirror or avatar of the Jews of Europe, upon which Christian and Jewish commentators projected their hopes, fears, and expectations concerning the Jewish people. These projections were highly flexible, and they reflect a wide variety of stories that are told about the lost tribes in Europe between roughly the 10th and 20th centuries. During the medieval period, the lost tribes begin to be referred to as the Red Jews, or Rote Juden, by German Christians, who believed that the lost tribes would come as an invading army in service of a future Jewish Messiah and or Antichrist. These Jewish tribes were labeled as red, a color which is associated with duplicitousness, treachery, bloodlust, and they were cast as having red hair, ruddy skin, and red clothing. Eventually, this legend was adapted into Old Yiddish stories from the German, where the Red Jews were recast as strong, powerful, and cunning. While a Jewish military force in service of a Jewish Messiah seemed threatening to European Christians, it was all the more exciting to European Jews. From this point on, the Rote Jidlech, as the Red Jews came to be called in Yiddish, begin to represent the possibility of a better and purer Jewish world that is out there somewhere, hidden behind a mostly impenetrable natural boundary. In Borodulin's novel, the Rote Jidlech are outwardly basically pretty similar to 1920s American Ashkenazi Jews, except for a few quirks. They speak Yiddish, which is a divergence from most stories, where they usually speak Hebrew or sometimes Aramaic. But they do use some Hebrew expressions and Hebrew naming conventions. For example, all last names are constructed as Ploni ben Ploni or Ploni bas Ploni. So Borodulin's protagonist is renamed from Sam Hoffman to Shmuel ben Yitzchak. There's a pretty negative review of the novel in the Freie Arbeiterstimme, which complains that these Red Jews speak as though they just came from Lithuania or Volhynia, and that the whole naming system that they use is, quote, a bissel zu viel for Yiddish Lechte. Their main identifying traits among the Leute Yiddelech are that they all have different shades of red hair and that they're very polite and calm. And their good manners, as well as some invisible genetic differences, are more important to the more eugenicist role that the Leute Yiddelech are playing for Borodulin, but I will come to that later on as well. There's some other aspects of Borodulin's Leute Yiddelech that mirror medieval and early modern stories about the lost tribes. For example, they live for a very long time, which is something that was also asserted in the medieval period by the traveler Eldad Hadani, a man who famously claimed to be himself a descendant of the lost tribes. They've also developed the technology to grow gold and diamonds in laboratories, such that all of their doorknobs and buttons and silverware are made out of these materials, which reflects an association of the red Jews with gold and precious stones. The Sambation was sometimes also described as flowing with precious gems, especially in Christian narratives. And even their association with scientific and technological prowess is very reminiscent of old Yiddish stories where the red Jews are cast as master sorcerers and magicians. So despite their heavy modernization, there are still traces of the mythical context that the novel is drawing on. And speaking of scientific and technological prowess, what is really striking about the world of Borodulin's Leute Yiddelech is that their lives are almost entirely regulated by human origin technology. They live in massive buildings shaped like pyramids that contain all of their homes, offices, factories, and restaurants. Each of these buildings is ventilated and air conditioned in a way that's meant to replicate the natural atmosphere outside. The Leute Yiddelech have abolished both animal husbandry and traditional agriculture, and they produce all of their food in what they call the biologische Stadt, which is a collection of massive buildings where lab-grown meat is produced in enormous quantities, and where all of their grains and vegetables are cultivated using vertical farming techniques and ultraviolet radiation. It's explained that this produces yields that are orders of magnitude larger than those in America. And there's a general obsession with fertility and agricultural productivity running throughout the novel. We're also told that the Leute Yiddelech have succeeded in adjusting their appetites through a social engineering campaign called Essen mit Moss. And so they no longer desire to overeat beyond the most minimally nutritionally necessary portion size. And none of this is presented as dystopian or Brave New Worldy. The reader is really meant to understand that these technological innovations are the height of progress and efficiency. This is a world where everything non-human has become totally and completely dominated by human industry and technology. There are vast amounts of uninhabited land on their side of the Sambation, but these areas are still subject to terraforming and geoengineering projects headed by the Leute Yiddelech. And in one of the many dialogues where one character explains some technological feat to Borodulin's protagonist, we learn that the Red Jews' land used to be full of great swamps and deserts, and that the largest body of water was surrounded by tall mountains. But to create more arable land, they cut down the mountains, ground up the stones, and filled in the swamps with sand. And it's not just the land that they transform through science, it's also their own population. One of the most interesting elements of the world that Borodulin builds in this novel is that the Leute Yiddelech practice a kind of eugenics program that is in some ways enforced by the Sambation as a national border. So after having spent a few days auf jener Zayt Sambation as a foreigner, Borodulin's protagonist, Sam Hoffmann, is put on trial to determine whether or not he will be allowed to remain in the country. Hoffmann understands that the Leute Yiddelech have a very strict anti-immigration policy and that there is a high risk that he might be deported. At first, he assumes that this is because he might be suspected of espionage, but it's explained to him that the real threat he poses to the Leute Yiddelech is a biological one. He's told that they have successfully purged the land on their side of the Sambation from dangerous disease-spreading bacteria, and that the Leute Yiddelech have developed a genetic immunity to various illnesses. In fact, not only have they become immune to certain viruses, they've also immunized themselves against harmful mental illnesses and negative emotional tendencies, including anger, greed, and dishonesty. Someone who comes from the other side of the river represents a threat to that genetic order. Hoffmann is told, quote, "You arrived here with blood which is liable to be infected with various diseases, and you brought with you a mind full of harmful tendencies, and you could infect the weaker among us with all of these things." The worst fear that the Leute Yiddelech have about Hoffmann is that he will fall in love with a local woman and that the two of them will create a new generation of people who will, quote, "carry in their blood all of the physical and mental defects that the Leute Yiddelech have worked so hard to cure themselves of." Although he's allowed to stay in the country following his immigration trial, Hoffmann does in fact fall in love with one of the local women, and she forces herself to undergo a kind of psychological operation that causes her to forget any of the feelings that she has for him. Hoffmann is then deported after his memory has been wiped, which forms the abrupt conclusion of the novel. And while this is framed as sad, it's not clear that it's meant to be seen as dystopian. The tone of the novel seems to suggest that this is all for the greater good. These anxieties around the contamination of blood and vulnerability to foreign diseases fit into a larger ecological imagination, which sees the human body as an organism to be protected, managed, and engineered to perfection through technological innovation. It's the same logic that structures how the natural environment is seen by Borodulin's Poetics as a body which needs to be tamed and reformed. Borodulin tries to justify this hermeticism through a kind of anti-colonial language. Towards the end of the novel, there's an explanation offered for why the Poetics guard their borders so harshly and are so intent on keeping themselves secret from the world. The reason we're given is that they fear that if their quality of life and technological capabilities were made known to the world, then they would become vulnerable to American or European colonization. And Borodulin does use the word colony to describe this. And while this may in some ways demonstrate a certain kind of anti-colonial political impulse on the part of Borodulin, I would argue that this fictional utopia on the other side of the Sambation still develops out of a colonial imagination. The Poetics are lauded for their ability to bend the non-human world to their will and turn the human body into an object of technoscientific management. Even Borodulin's anti-colonial gestures reflect a colonial ideal where the freedom from foreign occupation is really the freedom to pursue extractivist and eugenicist policies in peace and quiet. If we want to look through a post-colonial or Jewish post-colonial lens, there's certainly a way to read this novel as reflecting ideas about Zionism. Borodulin's Poetics have turned desolate and uninhabitable land into a healthy, fertile paradise replete with gold and diamonds, mirroring Zionist aspirations that Jewish settlement would refresh and renew a supposedly devitalized Palestine, and in doing so would usher in the creation of a regenerated Jewish people. And on the other hand, this is a book that was published in New York in 1929, and one didn't have to look far in 1920s North America to find support for eugenics and extractive colonial policies. Auf jener Zayt Sambation was published at a time when beliefs about population engineering were highly influential. Sterilization rates were rising, targeting people with mental and physical disabilities, at the same time that immigration laws were being greatly restricted in service of protecting the genetic integrity of the white Anglo-Saxon population. Only 5 years earlier, the Immigration Act of 1924 had been authored by eugenicists and passed by legislators hoping to curtail the influx of immigrants from Central and Southern Europe, as well as from East Asia. Just as the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans were imagined as guardrails against undesired immigration, in the novel, it's the Sambation itself who is policing the genetic borders, protecting the Poetics from outside contamination. Stories about the Red Jews typically serve as a fantasy of what Jewish power might look like. Isolated and empowered by the border technologies of the Sambation, they're able to enjoy the privileges of autonomy and self-determination. This often meant organizing militarily. Early modern European Christians feared an alliance between the Red Jews and the Ottomans, and they also imagined that they might be powerful allies against the Ottomans in a potential future war. Jews, on the other hand, imagined that the Red Jewish army would accompany the Messiah and deliver them from exile into the Holy Land. Power fantasies reflect the power ideals of their time. In the 16th century, that ideal might have been conceived in terms relative to the military might of the Ottoman Empire. And in 1920s North America, power was demonstrated through the ability to recondition a natural landscape for capitalist extraction, as well as through the authority to determine who is a racially foreign other, who is a threat to the population, and who is on the wrong side of the border. And I'm going to leave it there since I realized that I am a little bit over time. Thank you.
So I would like to begin, just jumping right in, by offering a short passage from S. Yizhar's now infamous novel, Khirbet Khiza from 1949, that introduces, I believe, the impetus for my talk and my interest in Mann in general. The narrator of Yizhar's novel, after violently expelling Palestinian families from their village, remarks the following about his presence in the so-called Arab village. He says, "I don't know why a feeling of loneliness suddenly thickened in me. What did we have to do with them? What did our young, fleeting lives have to do with their flea-bitten, desolate, stinking villages? These empty, God-forsaken villages were already getting on our nerves. Once villages were something you attacked and took by storm. Today, there were nothing but gaping emptiness, screaming out with a silence that was at once evil and sad. These bare villages, as you went through them all of a sudden, without knowing where from, you found yourself silently followed by invisible eyes of walls, courtyards, and alleyways. Desolate, abandoned silence. Yizhar imagines the ecology of the ethnically cleansed Arab village as one of invisible eyes and shameful stone structures. As Gil Hochberg comments on the same passage, Yizhar's language is stamped with the sign of the ghost. The violence of dispossession and the mark it leaves on prospects of futurity, of ecology, of space and memory is what Hochberg calls a haunting. Through this haunting, Yizhar invites us to imagine a confrontation with desolate, abandoned silence, dimat she'iyah natusha, that is the sudden, unbearable absence of a people where they were to be found only moments ago. For this reason, I have titled my talk as an engagement with Yizhar, and I will further explore ecologies of silence, polyphony, and trauma in the Palestinian village through the writings of Yizhar's Yiddish language contemporary, Mendel Mann. Mann's work is, in my opinion, among, like Mendel, I have my own opinions about these writers, but among the most vivid and striking accounts of Palestinian landscapes and memory in Yiddish language, in the Yiddish literature. And as I argue, Mann is constantly searching for a language that would allow for the human pain of expulsion to become deprovincialized and therefore legible to any who encounter it, regardless of national, ideological, or traumatic histories. Paradoxically, Mann attempts to render human pain universally legible through a polyphonic and hyper-local literary style, which foregrounds difference and the inability to communicate. Mann, perhaps controversially today, explores the possibility of comparison between disparate stories of immense suffering, such as setting the Nazi genocide of Eastern European Jewry in direct juxtaposition with the destruction of Palestinian life in over 418 villages dotting today's Israeli-Palestinian landscape, commonly known as the Nekba in Arabic, or as Mann refers to it in his Yiddish, die große Behole, the great chaos. The primary mechanism through which Mann attempts this feat is through various styles of ecological representation. In fact, landscapes and non-humans take a central role in Mann's work, with Mann's protagonists often being grapevines, trees, dogs, turtle doves, cacti, shadows, or stone structures, to name just a few examples. Virtually all of Mann's Palestinian stories, my term to refer to Mann's writings from 1948 to 1960 that focus on the Palestinian village, take place in the village of Yazur, a real Palestinian village that Mann himself resided in as a Holocaust refugee from 1948 until 1954, before his eventual departure from the State of Israel, never to return in 1961. I'm gonna not talk so much about Mann's biography today, but I'm happy to answer questions about it. Of the 418 Palestinian villages destroyed or erased from nationalist cartographies after the mass expulsion of Palestinians from their homes in and after 1948, more than 120, as you can see here, Arabic village memorial books have been published by Palestinian survivors who remember the life, culture, and contours of their villages before their destruction. These books include anecdotes, hand-drawn memory maps, archaeological records, stories, poetry, photos of relatives and homes that no longer exist. Many of these books were published in the series here, El-Qura al-Filistaniya al-Mudammara, from Zayt University, the destroyed Palestinian villages, it's called, over the ensuing decades, such as the village memorial book of Deir Yassin, shown here. Remarkably, in the Palestinian memorial book for the village of Yazur, there is a hand-drawn map of the village by a survivor and former resident, which matches almost exactly here the descriptions given by Mann in his fiction dealing with the village. Notice the large red structures in the center, which are marked in Arabic on the map as the village mosque and the shrine of Imam Ali, and which Mann in his works refers to as the Mechet Bergel, the mosque hill. This forms the nucleus of the village, with all other roads forming a web around these central structures, as well as the main road leading, it says, in the middle to Yafa or Al-Quds, Jerusalem. To introduce you all to the force of Mann's ecological descriptions, I'm going to read from my translation of his most explicitly ecological work, In Schatten von Weinstock, or In the Shadow of the Grapevine, published in 1960. Like virtually all of Mann's work about the Palestinian village, the experience of the Holocaust in Poland is placed directly beside all of these descriptions of Arab villages as a parallel narrative. Slava, in this story, a recent Holocaust survivor, settles in her new home that was populated by an Arab family only weeks previous. She moves in with her husband, Kunya, and their child, Velke. Slava is heavily implied to have suffered from some sort of sexual violence during her escape from Poland, which distances her from her husband and her child. Slava, unable to cope with the haunting all around her in the Palestinian village, seeing too much of the pain she recognizes from the Polish Holocaust, leaves the village forever, abandoning her husband and child. The story opens as such. Night after night, at the very same hour, a furious unknown cry sawed through the arid orange leaves. It would then become quiet, and in the night stillness you began to hear the stitching of crickets and the distant cooing of a turtle dove, the hissing of a snake who feels the void left by fear. In such an hour of the night, Slava left her bed and stood by the Arab window. She leaned herself on the iron grates and allowed the dull silver light to fall upon her from the moon. Cacti bordering her house, lighted by the full moon, came to life. It seemed as if they were casting human shadows, shadows who couldn't flee with their owners during the great chaos. Now they roam in the night searching for restitution, dark and expanding outward with dreadful longing. As the full moon reached its zenith, Slava saw how the needles of the native cacti began to resemble razor-thin silver embers. The moonlight had awakened the empty and moribund Arab orchard to a nocturnal life as the shine of the moon devoured the human cactus shadows. Slava saw how the climbing gray vine that nestled itself between the cactus leaves, a split vine of cramped twigs, opened its ripe and moist buds. The naked vine laid upon the cacti throughout the winter, parched and emaciated. The climbing plant could not run from its fate. Its new sprouting spring branches were left hanging in the void and searched for somewhere to brace themselves. They only ever found thorns. A consistent characteristic of Mann's representation of the abandoned Arab village is its pained and saddened character, its state of disrepair and Verlosenkeit, the aggressive, wailing, and lost wildlife, as well as the border demarcations of the land to the flora and fauna. Similarly, Meron Benevisti remarks in Sacred Landscape that visits to destroyed Palestinian villages are always botanical, and that the silhouette of the village was preserved only by cactus hedges, fruit trees growing wild, certain varieties of grasses and brambles that thrive in the ruins of inhabited sites. Rochelle Davis remarks similarly that the absence of cultural markers left in these desolate areas invests the surrounding trees with the power to represent what is gone. Roaming between these boundaries, bestowed with so much haunting, are the human-like shadows of the cacti, which Mann writes are searching for restitution, which in Yiddish is stylized through a Jewish vocabulary as tikkun. But I want to move us further into the narrative. Consider the following passage. No one knew the story of this grapevine beside Slava's window. And who could even attempt to tell the story since the prior residents of the village, the Arabs, disappeared in the thick of night? They left and took with them the wisdom of their sycamore-picking elders far into the desert. No one knew Slava's story either, the Jewish girl from Volhynia, and not the story of the orchard boy and the market peddler Kunya. No one was left of those Volhynian Jews either. Can a tree grasp the anguish of man just as man understands the anguish of the tree? Did the grapevine not feel the warm touch of Slava's shaking white fingers? Either way, the partnership of man and tree had now begun to coalesce. Here, Mann explicitly calls attention to the capacity for the bordered and haunted flora of the village to act as a witness to the pain of expelled Palestinians as well as Slava's wounds from surviving genocide in Volhynia. There is a mutual abandonment being expressed between the Yiddish-speaking Holocaust survivors and the Palestinian refugees whose homes they now occupy. And the village reacts to this abandonment with disease and moribundity. Mann writes, the roads of the village now lie halved and quartered. Avenues of asphalt cut through the light, sandy flatland, throwing open fencings and stabbed itself with a dagger-like sharpness into new roads to new Jewish settlements under construction. Like a great snake, dismembered and chopped apart, flailing only for a brief time with its prior life, so too are the roads without camels, without sycamore pickers, without donkey drivers, clutching on to their old lives. Everything about this desolated landscape torments and tortures the traumatized Holocaust survivors who are unable to find any peace in their new environment, constantly confronted with human suffering as expressed through the borders of tree and cacti, of dying grapevines and wailing animals. The landscape begins to literally cry out to the newly abandoned Kunia after his wife Slava's sudden departure. Like an echo, tree and plant, sky and earth call out, Kunia, Kunia. Even the birds in their flights called out, Kunia. He could not escape their calls. The Kunia of Hoshch is pursuing the Kunia of the Arab village. You will never be able to sever yourself. You must accept that Kunia from Volhynia, the market peddler doomed to mockery and ridicule, he was reminded of the words of his teacher in Cheder, and God fashioned for Cain a mark. Kunia bore the mark of Cain. Here we see a moment of successful communication between the landscape and Kunia, a survivor of genocide who pushes away any identification with his past. The ecological palimpsest that surrounds Kunia, composed of destroyed stone structures, birds perching on cacti, the jackals in the distance, are able to transcend this human linguistic barrier of communication and force Kunia out of his own provincialization of his memory and geographies. Indeed, it is the hyperlocal, haunting reminders of the Arab village specifically that are able to help Kunia view disparate experiences of himself, as well as awaken to the histories of prior Palestinian inhabitants. To make matters more explicit, Kunia is given the mark of Cain, which, while this is certainly not the only interpretation to be made, is, it should be noted, simultaneously a widespread motif in Yiddish writing about Palestinians, namely that one or the other represents a form of the Cain and Abel narrative. I would like to argue for a reading of Mann's works as relying on an acute polyphony. Here I'm working with Mikhail Bakhtin, where the intensely different forms of language present in his fiction, mimic the unstable and fragmented landscape. Far from being restricted to human language, the sound and languages of many non-human elements are to be expected in all of Mann's works. This polyphony is also a dysphonia, a disorder of communication, which produces unexpected strangeness as well as comfort. As Bakhtin writes in his discourse in the novel, language, like the living concrete environment in which the consciousness of the verbal artist lives, is never unitary. It is unitary only as an abstract grammatical system, taken in isolation from the concrete ideological conceptualizations that fill it, and in isolation from the uninterrupted process of historical becoming that is a characteristic of all living language. It represents the coexistence of socio-ideological contradictions between the present and the past, between differing epochs of the past, between socio-ideological groups in the present, between tendencies. These languages of heteroglossia intersect each other in a variety of ways, forming new socially typifying languages. Mann exploits this heteroglossia. He combines many different languages and registers in his Palestinian stories, relying on, just to name a few examples, Yiddish, Polish-Yiddish, Germanized Yiddish, Hebrew, Russian, Arabic, Policisms, the sound of lizards, jackals, the cloud, the birds, the trees, the hissing of snakes, cries of joy, wails, constant, discordant, and polyphonic style. In another work from Mann, in the Verwahrlosten Dorf, or In an Abandoned Village, published in 1954, another Holocaust survivor, Moyne, is attacked in his dreams by this polyphonic disunity of landscape, which taunts him for his inability to assimilate to nature. Mann writes the following: "The lizards would stand for hours on the building with their heads bowed upwards to the scorching sun, their disturbing mouths occupied with sparkling pearls. Moyne left for the field on the first dawn after his settling in the small Arab home. He was restless the entire night with the feeling that the deceased field was surrounding him. In his dreams, thorn bushes were attacking him, infesting his fences, the corners of his roof. Now they were already by his door. He can't move. The thorn bushes are everywhere, stabbing into his flesh, ripping apart his clothes, his skin, bloodying his face. Often, in his dreams, he would drift over the fields with a horrible scream, running towards the distant mountains, wanting to tear himself out of his sad valley, and finally end up lying, riddled with thorns and covered in blood by a line of cacti. These dreams were, however, rare. He awoke trembling on his bed, thinking only of the field. Around the house snaked a brown, small shrub called the stonebreaker, which bit into the dead stones, in their rips and cracks where the wind carried its red dust and spread in the cracked stone its knotted roots. The stonebreaker twisted itself into everywhere, onto every corner in the fences. unnoticed. And you, son of Adam, why can't you twist and climb into the earth? Mann, I believe, is searching for a universal aesthetic of devastation, of pain, whether Palestinian, Jewish, or otherwise. Indeed, in another section of the same work, the confrontation with a Palestinian returning to the village provokes an immense cognitive dissonance among the Yiddish-speaking settlers, at least one of whom remarks the following. But then the Jews of the street all went home, with such a sadness and such an anxiety that it aroused their silence and half-sleeping memories. A wheel had been spun, a wheel of fate at disorienting speed. Home, homelessness, destruction, strangeness, distance, ships on seas, and home again. These Jews now felt for the first time that this was not merely Jewish fate, but the fate of man, of people, and of the entire world. One time us, another time them, said the tailor from Beirich as he wiped his spirited thick glasses lenses. Perhaps the dampness came from sweat, or perhaps from stifled tears. The Chassid from Munkach with the blonde beard became sad and spoke again in his Hungarian accent. What to do? God guides his little world. Do we have a choice? The linking of the ecologies of the Polish forests and of Palestinian deserts is not Mann's way of equivocating or even comparing in a trite sense one environment or history with another, but instead an attempt at accessing the physical, natural, and living effects of suffering through Yiddish, what Mann refers to as the fate of man and all people. Mann's ecologies are painful and aggressive. They resist catharsis and emphasize the natural monuments to ethnic cleansing, genocide, and war as fading but present witnesses. His landscapes call out to these Holocaust survivors, trapped in their memories of Poland and tormented in the Palestinian village, wanting to cross the taboo barrier of communication between human and non-human. Mann's work also demarcates every corner, every road, every stone of Yazur. In this sense, I don't think a reading of Mann's works as a form of memorial book is out of the question, whether for the Polish villages of Kuchare, as he describes, or the Palestinian village of Yazur. The astounding detail with which Mann's work corresponds to the Palestinian villagers' memory maps, almost demands a deeper conversation between them, a conversation that Mann's works tried to jumpstart in a time before the further and slippery evolution of nationalist conceptions of history in the decades that followed. And with that, thank you.
Well, thank you so much for the opening panel, and to Auden as well. I've not heard your papers before, but I am struck by this question of what does it mean to make nature or to make a landscape Jewish or to make a place Yiddish, right? And that's kind of come through in different modes in each of them, with Mendel's paper thinking about the description of Vilna as a Yiddish text in a sense. As well. So do you have questions for one another that you'd like to start with? Okay.
It's always
you get
hard
the
when you're
first
in
question.
a meeting that.
I could. I noticed, Mendel, that you mentioned heteroglossia,
Yeah,
which also came up in my talk,
yeah,
and it seems would be relevant to Auden as well.
yeah.
So I'd love to hear more about your. You also mentioned that you'd love to talk more about the non-Jews of Kulbak and
Right.
these disparate discourses. So you want to talk more about heteroglossia?
Yeah, well, just say, yeah, so Bakhtin was kind of the important theorist for my dissertation and specifically my reading of Zalman Yahner, and heteroglossia has remained important for me and other work as well. But in Zalman Yahner, I think what I was interested in with heteroglossia was the kind of microcosm, or which is similar to what you're saying of the super local, but then the diversity of language types that exist in a microcosm, which led it to then also be representative of larger spaces. So there, in Zalman Yahner, it's differences in generational languages was something I was interested in that reflects the kind of different relationships of the generationist Soviet project. There are also non-Jewish Belarusians who are part of the cast of Zalman Yahner. So there's some great, actually kind of diglossic or multilingual discussions between like Russian of varying fluencies spoken by the Jewish characters with the non-Jewish characters. And then Kulbak also presents the Zalmanjaners as speaking their own idiolect, like of having their own formal language that's part of their. So that was really important in my reading there. And yeah, I just think like your reading suggests that it's such a useful way of paying attention to the linguistic diversity of many literary texts that we're reading, but also a way to see their locatedness, right? That they aren't generic or happening anywhere. They're happening in like very specific kind of configurations of place that's shown in through language as one of the ways of showing it.
Also struck in your papers about how time is a place, right? How for nighttime, you have this incredible image of the cacti resembles silver needles at night. So there's a sense that space inverts in some way at night. And then the image, right, with Kulbak, there's so much gazing at stars in Kulbak in general, but also the kind of mirror life of the forest and the hafe, right, of the courtyard. And then of course, for Auden's really fascinating paper, the other side of the river is this kind of mirror space. And what kind of, is it a legacy of utopian or dystopian ecological thinking? So I was struck by that as well. We have a question from Mara Benjamin, who says, that was a truly incredible paper. Thank you so much. I'd love to read it if you're willing to share. Oh no, sorry, that was not a question.
And any questions will come through the raise hand thing, and I think no one has raised.
Okay, sorry about that. Well, there is appreciation from Mara Benjamin online. Any questions from audience here? Yes, please, and if you can introduce yourself. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jessica Kurtzman. I was thinking about the relationship to time also in these three papers, and the way that it seems like, Mendel, in your paper, the kind of stagnancy that's happening seems to be kind of like holding in stagnancy. It seems to be like maybe there isn't a process or a sense of progress, but that stagnancy is the state of being. And maybe that's also the case, Auden, in your paper, that there's a kind of sterility that is a state that doesn't move or change over time. And maybe also, Eyshe, that's happening in your paper, that the kind of feeling of historical memory being present in nature doesn't seem to be sort of, it seems to be in a specific moment. But do you see a kind of in any of these stories a sense of a kind of progression of the process over the course of nature? Do you see a kind of cyclical time in nature, or is it more a kind of steadiness?
Sure, I can start maybe.
Yeah.
So in terms of progress in the cycle, I think, so the cyclical nature of time is permeated all throughout Mann's works. He talks again and again in many of his stories about how there are these cycles of pain, cycles of hurt, cycles of natural decay, and then the restoration of life. What's perhaps interesting in many of his works is that a lot of his protagonists, the human protagonists, have very disparate relationships to the village that they inhabit. In fact, some of them, like the protagonist of his main novel, his big epic novel, In an Abandoned Village, eventually realizes that he can assimilate to nature and understand the village by working the land. So it's actually, I think, an interesting take on the sort of at the time in the state of Israel, this Zionist approach to land of working the land and restoring it. But from his perspective, it's not towards this state building goal, it's towards a communion with the earth and restoring maybe a debt that resides in the land and working towards this idea of tikkun and restitution through taking care of the natural environment. So in the Farvolo, in an abandoned village, evolves towards this sort of endpoint where Moyne, throughout all his struggles in the novel, finally feels at home in the village. That's sort of where it ends up. So there is a progress towards a horizon where there's a possibility of belonging even after expulsion and massive pain, even in places where you might be occupying another person's history. And you can think about that history and engage with it in ways that are different than other people. In the shadow of a grapevine, it's a completely different relationship to the land. Slava leaves. She can't take it. She can't stay on the village. She leaves her husband and she leaves her child. It's heavily implied that it's due to her sexual trauma, but it's also shown later that she couldn't psychologically take the pain of being near the grapevine for some reason. She associated the grapevine with this decay, this stagnation that you're talking about that she needed to move away from. And what she ends up doing is she moves to Tel Aviv and she hires a Yemeni servant in her home, who then goes back to the village and marries her ex-husband. Through this weird network, she then gives gifts to the Yemeni servant to give to her child still residing in the Palestinian village in this weird sort of multi-layered kind of handing off of ways she can contribute to her family, but she can't psychologically bear, being around the actual physical landscape. So maybe that's a helpful answer, but I think Mann is very interested in that idea of progress and where to go, and I don't think he ever finds a coherent answer to it. I think that's one of the limits of his work.
I can say something to that question too, and I don't know if Auden wanted to, but just going to say, I think cyclical time is also really important in Kulbak's work, which is the attention to like what season it is and descriptions of that along with day and night. And that does feel quite cyclical, and sometimes the seasonal times kind of don't seem to follow each other in order, which leads to a sense of like, how directly related are these different chapters? In Zelman-Yaner, I'd be interested if it had to do when the sections were actually published, were they corresponding? But I do think in Zelman-Yaner, stagnancy is progressing. Like that's the second part is about like the downfall of the family. His attitude toward that is not clear, but things are degrading and you're seeing that things are degrading. And I think that's different maybe from Vilna and Mashiach ben Ephraim, where there's like kind of a more of a timeless state of decay. Yeah.
If there's still time, I was wondering if I could respond to this question as well. Or...
Oh, yes, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question of time is really interesting. And in Borodulin's novel, one of the things that really captured my attention was this question of how is the future or the cutting edge moment being constructed? And it's very clearly being constructed through the constant negation of nature, through the constant negation of the non-human, which is also something that happens in Zelman-Yaner. It's the way that the future is being constructed, but that's also the way that the past is constructed. The Zelman-Yaner family home is constructed as being in the past because of their resistance to accept certain technological innovations or adaptations like electricity or like, I don't know, tram lines or whatever it might be. And it's through that kind of tension or interaction between erasure and anti-erasure that the stance or attitude of Do'ikayt seems to emerge to me, which is something that I was thinking through in both of your papers, this idea of Do'ikayt as kind of a space of tension and polyphony that emerges through that that Hereness being a shared Hereness that's contested between different attitudes towards what should be the here and now and what comes next.
Thank you. We have a question from Daniel Baker online. Oh, actually,
Are you okay with
yeah, actually, Daniel Baker and Hannah Pauline Galai, would you mind typing your questions into the chat and I'll read it aloud so everyone can hear it, if that's all right. In the meanwhile, we have, yes.
Hi, thank you so much, everybody. This was just a really beautiful, amazing panel, including a gorgeous introduction, which was close to my heart because I'm working on a project about layers of memory in New York City. So it was like perfect. My question is for you, Eyshe, about the Yitzchor and has there been already scholarship that like explicitly compares the Arabic memorial books with the Yitzchor from Eastern Europe, or is that emerging?
So there is, and I wanted to include it, but I realized the talk would just become that and not Mendel Mann, so I decided to scrap it. But no, the first major book on that topic was written by Susan Somovich. Someone can help me pronounce her last name. And it's called The Object of Memory, Jews and Arabs Narrate the Palestinian Village. And the beginning of that work was because she also noticed the similar grammars and styles of Yizker Bicher and the Palestinian memorial books. And she was interested in delineating not only their similarities, but also their differences and how they have very different approaches to how they think about the things that they're actually memorializing. I think she comments that, for example, the Yizker Bicher had no hope of return. There was never a hope of, at least in her analysis, of turning these Eastern European Städtlach into something as a viable future again. Whereas the approach of the Palestinian books is the exact opposite. In fact, there is this constant refrain in these books about returning to the land, reviving it, having some sort of communion back with it. So they have very different, maybe intents and directions, but what she was pulling out is this, as you bring up, this common grammar between them. And then there's another book by Rochelle A. Davis called Palestinian Village Histories, I think. And that book is another study of those books that compares them to Yizker Bicher and certain.
Awesome, thank you.
We have a question from Hannah Pauline Galai for Auden, who asks, who were some of Borodulin's natural science influences?
This is a great question. I unfortunately don't have a great answer for it. It's not entirely clear to me where he got his interest in natural science writing from. He mentions throughout the novel various scientists, chemists, geographers that he is pulling some of the inspiration for his imagined technological innovations from. But I would have to do a lot more digging in the columns that he wrote for Do'ikayt and Beirich and other papers to get a real handle on where he was drawing his inspiration from. But I'm curious as well. Thank you.
I have two questions. So my first question is for Mendel. Mendel, I love this image that you invoked of like winter as a herring.
Yeah.
And maybe I'm obtuse, but I still don't get it. So I would love if you could share what is your reading of that, and then also what are you doing methodologically, right? What is how does bringing in an oral history, an ego document from an associate, right? What does that do for your study? And then my second question is for Auden. Auden, I would love to hear you expand on colonialism and speculative fiction. I'm curious, I'm thinking about the fantasy of the lost tribe and the longing to discover the tribe. And I'm curious if you see this Yiddish speculative fiction as fitting in within a larger body of Western speculative fiction and colonial writing, or if there's something particularly Jewish about these things.
So, okay, cold like a fish is kind of as close as I can get to what happened for Kulbak. And I don't know if he had it in mind already. I never understood this idea that he had somebody bring in a fish and then open up his window to make his classroom cold. And this was supposed to be a writing prompt for his students. But it's, that scene was likely only a couple of years before Zalmanyaner began to be published in Minsk, and then the image of Chayela's heart, winter flopped like a silver fish in Chayela's heart, is from one of the early chapters of Zalmanyaner. So there's like a proximity in Kulbak's life between that amazing anecdote that Harshav relays and the image. But do I understand it beyond trying to imagine what it would feel like to have winter flop in your heart like a silver fish? That's as far as I come with it. And I would just say, I haven't really integrated it here, but I've been fascinated to find, biographical examples from Yiddish writers that I write about that give some insight into some of their work. This one, the other kind of major example for me is Walter Katzizna, who people know as a photographer and a writer. I've found a number of connections between specific photographs that he took and then visual descriptions in his novels. Partly I just find that kind of personally moving, when you can find these moments of connection between the writer and their writing, and perhaps it's about not getting to hear a lot from them. So like when we find these kind of details, it feels quite special in Yiddish literary studies, but I don't have it like theorized beyond that.
Thank you. We have oh, sorry.
I just to answer the second part of that question, I think the connection between the speculative fiction genre and the broader colonial context and the fantasy of reunification with the lost tribes is a really interesting set of connections. And I'm still at the beginning of working out this work and exploring those connections in more detail. I think that there are a couple of different strands that are converging in Auf jener Zayt Sambatyon. It's speculative, but it's also coming, of course, from the kind of tradition of lost world fiction of the late 19th and early 20th century, which was deeply based in colonial experiences of archaeology and exploration of lands that were trying to be connected or tied into the imperial core. I think that there are whether or not there are elements of it that are specifically Jewish. I think one thing about this story that to me feels specifically Jewish goes back to the point that we were talking about a couple of questions earlier with heteroglossia, which is that in Jewish tradition, there is, on the one hand, a familiarity with heteroglossia as the natural state and a kind of a familiarity with having to contend with heteroglossia and what that might mean under better or worse circumstances. But then there's also the attention between that and this sort of destructive desire or drive towards Jewish monoglossia, which shows up in Zionism, but also obviously in Yiddish territorialist movements as well. And I think that that's kind of what's at the heart of this novel when it comes to the colonial story is whether or not that kind of reunification with a Jewish monoglossia it is possible, and what that would mean for Jewish communal identity.
Thanks so much, Auden. We have a question from Daniel Baker, which is specifically for Mendel. If I understood your paper correctly, you seem to suggest that Kulbak's ecological imagery reflects a largely optimistic view of Jewish integration into Eastern European landscape. I was struck, however, by how ambivalent it seems, especially the image of grass growing through a character's body, which strongly evokes decaying corpses buried in the ground. What do you make of this ambivalence? And Daniel Baker also asks if you've thought about resonance between Kulbak and Bruno Schulz. But maybe thinking about the question of optimism here, which also echoes through the other two papers and how you're negotiating utopian and dystopian ideas of ecology. But optimism.
I would say that, in my like dissertation chapters on Do'ikayt, ambivalence was a hugely important category that I was reading. I was reading ambivalence as like a way of understanding the relationship to place, that they're both staking claims to belongingness in positive ways, and also all of the challenges and deficiencies that like need to be improved for Jewish life to continue, and reading that as ambivalent about the relationship in place. So I think ambivalence is probably right, especially in a work like Imaginaries. The question I'd want to explore is there might be a difference between Kulbak's relation with the more rural spaces of Reisen and his depictions of the more urban spaces, that like some of the depictions of kind of the long history of rural Jewish life in Reisen, maybe there's some more optimism there than in something like the kind of permanent stagnation of Vilna that's comes out in these images, and the kind of quick decline that's happening in Zalmanyaner. So I don't know, but thanks to this question, I'll think about that.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, is there a Yiddish eco-optimism or an eco-pessimism?
Right.
Yeah, and if you could introduce yourself.
Sure, Caleb Schurz. A question for Auden in particular. Auden, I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about, or maybe speculate on, I mean, I'm sure it's not possible to say exactly why you think Borodulin moved from sort of writing nonfiction and popular science to writing speculative fiction. I'm curious, especially because I'm going to be talking on the next panel, and the subject of my paper, Avram Golem, pulls a sort of very similar move in his early career, which we'll see. He sort of begins by creating more explicitly practical texts or sort of popular science texts, and then moves into creating these strange children's books effectively. It's again, this kind of like move towards the, I guess, move towards the fictional or move towards the speculative. It's a means of bringing about science education.
That's a great question. I mean, from my knowledge, Borodulin was interested in fiction from early on in his writing career. So he did write some serialized stories in the same papers that he would publish natural science columns in that I unfortunately have not yet read. And I wonder if I have a couple ideas. You know, it might be that his interest in writing Yiddish speculative fiction was in trying to fill a niche that he saw not being filled in Yiddish, the same way that he saw natural science writing in general as either unfilled or inadequately filled as a genre of Yiddish writing. On the other hand, I think he was interested in the kind of stories that science tells about progress and about peoples and geographies and spaces and places. He writes on a variety of hard and soft sciences, I would say. Some of his work is very hard sciencey. It's on new chemical discoveries or new mechanical innovations, but there are also articles that he writes that are more ethnographic. Like he writes an article about the Samaritan population in Nablus and about how they celebrate Pesach. So I think that he, as much as maybe he sees himself as a scientist first and foremost, he is thinking about science in a kind of broader or more expansive way where science is supposed to tell us something about where we are headed as a people, specifically about where Jews are headed as a people.
Thank you.
I had a question also for Auden. I was wondering if you could
Introduce yourself.
Oh, I'm Charlotte Hopkins. I don't do any active research, so you won't hear anything else from me. I was wondering if you've read In the Future City of Edenia, and if you have, if you see like connections between that work and off the other side.
I'm not familiar with this book. Do you mind repeating the title? Because I'm very curious now.
It's the Yiddish would be In Zukunft statt Edenia. It's a very fun, also Yiddish speculative fiction piece about sort of an outsider who goes to a technologically advanced Jewish multicultural city, has experiences there. It's quite short, so
There's the translation on Ingeveb.
There's, and the artist Jenny Afeeks did a project about it as well, which you can find. So yes, fantastic. More Yiddish sci-fi, which we also feel ambivalent about. So we, maybe a very quick question, if that's possible, and then we'll have lunch.
Sure. Hi, my name is Sarah, and my research is mostly on water and rocks, and and outdoor education. And I'm just curious about the parallel that I've seen between the three stories around water and rocks. I think being alive, but not being dead, and having a role that is beyond just for agriculture or for building homes.
So I'll just, one of the things I didn't get to talk about today, but I would like to, is that I know of at least 2 examples in which Kulbak writes about rivers as like personified naiad spirits, as kind of folkloric spirits. So I think that's an important element here that I haven't gotten to explore more. And there are a couple other instances in which like nature actually becomes a giant in the hill, or there's an amazing image of like the prophet Elijah kind of constructs himself out of natural elements in a vision that Benya has, but the rivers seem to be a special fixture. And I guess that it has something to do also with like non-Jewish folklores in the area, and I want to look into that.
Yeah, wonderful, thank you. And Ken Moss notes that he and Gennady Estreich also have a chapter about Edenia as well. So I can share that information. Shkoyach, for our first panel,